Hi everyone, it's William with the 1921 Grand Duke Dmitri Diary series, and we will be doing part 3 of the long diary entry of 31st March. So I've got a little natural light today coming in through the window since I'm doing this earlier than usual. The views weren't great for the previous video, and I understand that because Dmitri has already said a lot about the Kronstadt uprising. He had a lot to say, and so we heard a lot of it earlier on, and when he decided to resume that topic upon his return to France, which was understandable because it had finally been resolved. While he'd been traveling, it had still been an ongoing thing. So he had more to say about it. So that basically is the recap. More speculation on his part about why the Kronstadt uprising failed, and he was far from alone in that. Pretty much the whole emigration, whether right, left, or center, were trying to dissect this and figure out what had gone wrong. And one of the theories was that it was the fact that the rebels were including on their signs and in their slogans anti-Semitic phrases, and this scared off the members of the Entente from giving them necessary support. So I don't know if that was the deciding factor or not. Dmitri didn't know if it was the deciding factor or not, but anyway, he brought it up. Okay, so for our cast of characters today, we have only one new person, one old person, Milyukov, and one new person, a very, very interesting man by the name of Vladimir Burtsev. Some of you have possibly heard of him. Any of you who are really immersed in Russian history have certainly heard of him. All right, so I'm going to do a long section of this today because I think it merits it. And yeah, let's dive in. There are two newspapers in Paris. They are both of a social revolutionary type, but one, Common Cause, is edited by Burtsev with the support of Wrangel, and the other, The Latest News, the latest nastiness as many people call it, serves as an organ of the former members of the provisional government and is edited by Milyukov. Both of these newspapers, of course, sang the praises of Kronstadt, by which I mean primarily that, choking with sentiment, they praised and recited the slogans with which the sailors and workers adorned themselves. Along with this moral support of Kronstadt, these newspapers intimidated the right-wingers, being terribly afraid that they would be able to gain some benefit from this supposedly national anti-Bolshevik movement. Both newspapers fired off the most vulgar articles on that topic, ridiculing the hopes and desires expressed in right-wing circles. That campaign, alas, just happened to coincide with my trip to Berlin, which was painted in completely erroneous hues. The receptions that were given for me by the Russian National Assembly of Berlin were interpreted in a political sense as preparation for some kind of movement. Even in the French press, they were writing about some kind of guard of honor meeting me at the station, saying that I intended to go to Russia, and ending by starting to say that my visit to Copenhagen was only camouflage from my real goal, to be closer to the events in Kronstadt. Because my visit to Berlin received such publicity and unwanted coloring, which I talked about earlier, all this was very unpleasant for me. This furor, in addition to the fact that it could render my life very disagreeable on a personal level, only had a negative effect and spoiled the monarchical cause itself. They began to refer to me as a candidate for the throne and clearly hinted that I was taking this candidacy upon myself, taking it upon myself and imposing it on others. Both of the Paris newspapers spared neither words nor paper in their effort to portray both me and the monarchist in as bad and stupid a light as possible. All right, so this is a real crisis for Dmitri, my friends, even if it doesn't seem like that big of a deal to us. It was a real crisis. So Dmitri, of course, hadn't known about the Kronstadt uprising. He hadn't known when he decided to go off to Denmark to visit the Marlings. Crispin, Duke, that was something that was going to happen. Oh dear. Can we ride this out? Duke! Crispin! Well, let's give it a try. Crispin! I don't know. It was just a neighbor walking by that they could see out the front window. Come here, Duke. So we'll see. Sorry about that interruption. So as I was saying, Dmitri hadn't known that all this was going to happen. But as it turned out, the timing was disastrous, pretty much, because it seemed like it was, maybe more than a coincidence that he was there when you had the first big thing since the revolution, really. The first thing from inside Russia that made hopes skyrocket on all in all parts of the political emigration. The emigre political outlook. I don't know. So we have these two newspapers. And when Dmitri says that they are social revolutionary in nature, he doesn't mean that they are organs of the socialist revolutionary political party. They were not. He just means that they're to the left. And you could indeed call Burtsev's press organ a revolutionary paper because he was himself a revolutionary, although I'm not sure that fit after the actual revolution, that you would still call it that. So that was the one called Common Cause. And it's very, very interesting to me that Pyotr Wrangel, the famous white Russian general, and really the only one left standing, the only one who still had a body of troops, whom he was trying to represent and help in emigration and to keep in some kind of discipline. They were being evacuated to various countries in Europe. Some had even had an offer to go, I think, to Argentina. And he was doing his best to continue to be their leader. And he was not what you would call a liberal, but he was also not on board with the far-right movement that he clearly saw was would represented an encroachment on the part of Germany. So it's very interesting. If Dmitri's correct, he might not have been, that Wrangel was giving financial support to Common Cause. So the name in Russia of this journal was Obshaya Delo. And so who was Burtsev, the editor and founder of the paper? Vladimir Lvovich Burtsev. He was really an old guard revolutionary. I mean, not that old. He was about to turn 60. I think he would turn 60 in 1922. And he was a revolutionary in more ways than one. He'd started out as strongly anti-Tsarist before the revolution, and at this point he was strongly anti-Bolshevik, very strongly, and he would end up being very strongly anti-Nazi. He was living in France during the Second World War. Way back when, in Imperial Russia, he'd been a member of Narodnaya Volya, the group that had conspired and carried out the assassination of Dmitri's grandfather, Alexander II, but he himself had not been a part of that. He hadn't even been living in the capital at that time. Later on, when he'd had to leave Russia, he was actually kicked out of Switzerland. So, you know, Switzerland is very generous toward political refugees, and they had taken in many. But during the pre-revolutionary part of Russian history, but they kicked Bortsev out, specifically because Bortsev published or gave a statement advocating the assassination of Nicholas II, calling for it. So that was a terrible thing to do. I think we can all agree on that, you know, to suggest that someone should go out and kill a family man with 5 children and a person who was arguably just doing the best he knew how, even though he wasn't doing it very well. You know, his best wasn't good enough. Another thing that he did in the pre-revolutionary era was to expose double agents. So the revolutionary movement in Russia was rife with double agents, and he exposed several of them. And later on, something that he would do in the 30s would be to act very strenuously to debunk the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So good for him in that respect. Hopefully he had repented of his earlier calls for Nicholas II to be killed. Let us hope so. I mean, people can change, because after the revolution, he seems to have been, you know, a pretty constructive figure. Okay, so we already know Milyukov, Pavel Milyukov, who was very much a left of center but moderate, not an extremist at all, whom Dmitri had turned to as a possible mentor when both of them were in London in 1919-1920. And he was the editor of this very popular paper, a much bigger circulation than Общее дело, that was called Последние новости. The latest news, you could translate it breaking news, but the latest news, or as Dmitri refers to it, the latest nastiness. Although Dmitri wasn't really at odds, after all, with either Milyukov or Последние новости. He's just upset at the moment. Okay, so let's see, that's the 2 of those. And I have had a great bit of luck, for which I thank all of you, because since I've been doing these videos, it's kind of given a new given new life and revitalized my research, which had been stagnant for a while. You know, it's given me the motivation to do that. And I always figured, well, in the past, it has been very, very difficult to obtain any of these emigre newspapers from before the Second World War. But now, of course, in the age of digitalization, lo and behold, I've been able to find that they're available online through the Russian digital library. So if you want to look at them yourself, you can find them at elib.shpl.ru, and they have both. Fewer of Общее дело, but they have they have the 1921 copies of both newspapers. So this opens up a whole new line of research for me, and one that I expect to be extremely productive, because that's really been the chink in my armor. The gap in my research has been these emigre newspapers that Dmitri and the whole immigration were so much tuned into during this period. So I don't think so much Общее дело, but Последние новости will definitely have a lot to say about Dmitri, about Kirill, about all young Russia, about everything that's going on. So that's great. All right. So that will give me the possibility, hopefully, to find out exactly how nasty these things that they were saying about Dmitri's trip to Berlin were. Was he overreacting? Or we'll see anyway. Okay, board says blah blah blah. Yeah, so when Dmitri refers to the intimidation of the right wing by these two newspapers, it's hard to conceive that the right wing, who were mostly in Germany, of the emigration, would be intimidated by a couple of newspapers, emigre newspapers in Paris. I don't know, but certainly they would have seen Dmitri's appearance in Berlin under those circumstances as a threat. The left-wing movement, which was mostly in France, and he says that they were afraid that he was going to start a movement. So that's interesting. They interpreted the receptions that were given him by the Russian National Assembly as preparation for some kind of movement. And yeah, that always, whenever that word is used, it always makes me think of Hannah Arendt's distinction that she drew between political parties and movements. And her opinion was that a political party, no matter how noxious, was always something that, political parties come and go, something that could be handled, but movements are what are truly dangerous. And I think I agree with that. When they're bad movements. That is what Dmitri was not, of course, by any stretch of the imagination, trying to start a movement. Kazimierz would try to start a movement with Young Russia, but that's a topic for another time. Okay, and so this idea that that Dmitri was not only presenting himself as candidate for the throne, but doing it in this very presumptuous way, self-proclaimed way, and imposing that on others, and that's that's not Dmitri, that's Kirill, that would be Kirill. So they had the wrong man in that respect. And then the French press piled on. That's another thing I need to look into. And the French press apparently went even further and said and tied the Danish trip into this whole thing, that it meant that Dmitri wanted to be close to Russia and close to Kronstadt. I mean, that's kind of absurd because Kronstadt hadn't started. As I said, the uprising hadn't started when Dmitri went to Denmark, and nobody could have foreseen it. But they had this notion that he wanted to be close to the border so that he could go triumphantly over to Russia. Crazy. Although at one point, allegedly, much later, in 1938, he did actually contemplate, almost was lured into going back to Russia. But that is something that, a claim that was made by Grunwald, Konstantin Grunwald. I don't know if it's true or not. Okay, so Dmitri refers to this as being difficult for him on a personal level. And yeah, he was basically called bad and stupid, although he's trying to ameliorate that a little bit. And at the same time, trying to say, oh, well, it's not that I care what they do to me, but it's ruinous for the whole monarchical movement, the whole monarchist movement, not just the right-wing monarchist movement. But anyway, he may have been, he may be figuring out that he's a little too thin-skinned for this kind of political activity and being out in front and in public in this way. And it's not that he was thin-skinned in the sense of being angry and lashing out and wanting revenge. Sure, he could get a little angry, but who wouldn't? But he wasn't a vindictive person. He wasn't looking for revenge against any of the people who had slighted or him or hurt his feelings. But what he did do in situations like this is to really internalize the criticism, and that's what made it so disastrous for him. So it makes me think, people sometimes think of the Romanovs as being, impervious to any criticism, and just looking down their noses at and being self-righteous at anyone who would dare to criticize them. But it wasn't really the case, and the okay, more or less. For instance, with Nicholas and Alexandra and Rasputin, I don't think it made them feel good, but they considered themselves right, and they didn't internalize it, right? But it makes me think of an example of the Empress. Which one was it? Alexandra. Good Lord, how stupid! I did my dissertation on this, and now I can't remember her name. So Alexander II's wife, was she also a Maria Fyodorovna? I can't. Getting old. Okay, so there was. So this is another instance. There was a newspaper. It was a banned newspaper in Russia. It was called The Bell, Kolokol. Not sure where the stress goes. And it was banned in Russia, and yet it had a wide circulation, and even members of the imperial family read it, not just to keep track of what the enemy is doing, so to speak, but because it was an interesting journal. And she was one of the people who read it, and there was an article in it about how the education of the Grand Dukes was completely useless and absurd, and she took that so much to heart that apparently she burst into tears after reading it. This was one of the younger children's nannies who wrote about this. And it just crushed her because she had personally taken charge of directing the children's education. And the criticism just struck home with her, and she thought she was genuinely made her think that she was doing a bad job, and it caused her to cry. With Dmitri, I think a similar thing. I'm not saying he burst into tears, but a similar thing. He really internalized this sort of thing, and that made it particularly hard for him. And we're going to find out more about that. He's going to tell us more about how he responded personally and how it made him feel and how devastating it was for him. Meanwhile, in the next section, in section 4 of the long diary entry, we will learn about an attempt on his part to do some damage control by giving an actual interview to one of these newspapers. And you recall when he was in Berlin, one of the emigre newspapers there sent a reporter who wrote about a speech he gave for the Russian National Assembly and said, quite benignly, that he told them that, all of this effort is a bit premature. And they were all up in arms about that, and they wanted him to refute that. And he said, no, I'm not going to refute it. He didn't want to refute it. And I think part of the reason he didn't want to refute it was because, he wisely could see that it would be something that he should say precisely in order to not fall under the kind of criticism that he ended up falling under in Paris. That he wasn't there ready to go into Russia and proclaim himself Tsar, that he was saying, hey, let's slow down with all of this a little bit. But anyway, this time he is going to go further and try to do some damage control and give an interview. So now I've got my fingers crossed that I'll be able to find that interview in the paper, and, you know, but I'm not going to slow down while I search for that. I'm going to go ahead and do another video. Who knows, though? Maybe I'll find it tonight. Anyway, come back for that. Sorry about being so long-winded. And yeah, thanks for watching these particular ones. I think they're among the most important. So hopefully I'll see you next time. Bye.